So really quickly, if you've still got this file open, great. If you don't, I'll just look up at my screen. So basically what I did was a history snapshot of what it looked like. So this is the original image with no blurring at all. This is what it looks like with the depth of field created by that lens blur, again, using the depth map and the whole 9 yards. And then this is the Smart Object one. This is just the Gaussian Blur. And in my opinion, there's just a world of difference in this. This actually looks believable to me. This just looks blurred to me. So, at any rate, the next thing I want to show you guys is sort of next level split frequency work. It seems like a lot of you guys are doing split frequency work. Is that fair to say? Or at least you found it useful in all the stuff that you're actually working on. So the next thing I'm going to show you truly came out of desperation for me. And so I'm going to show you how it works. We'll just have a conversation about all of this parts of it. So at any rate, the file that I need you to open is in class seven. So if you can go to your class number 7, the working files from session number 7. And inside that folder is the split frequency retouching folder. If you'll click on that. And then inside that split frequency retouching folder, there is a folder called Frequency Separation Images. Open that up. And then the image that you're looking for is the one that we very first demoed when we were looking at the split frequency retouching image. It's the girl that's on green. If you can actually open that up into Photoshop, this is what it looks like. So is everybody able to, anybody not find this image? Okay. So we're going to go ahead and split this. Again, I've got the virgin copy is sitting right here. I'm going to make 2 copies. Again, we're just going to do this as the standard split. That's where we're going to start with this. So Command J twice to make 2 copies. Double click on the one in the middle and call it low. Double click on the one on the very top and call it high. Turn off the eyeball for the one that says high. Select the one in the middle that says low. And then we need to zoom in to 100% at this girl's face. And at 100%, I have a pretty good idea of, again, the texture part that I'm trying to get rid of. I'm actually going to zip in one more time here. Because what I'm really looking for, the issue that I've got with this, it's not just the little hairs on her skin, but it's actually the texture of her skin. Now you can see that there's a bunch of like little white dots on her skin, whatever. She doesn't have to, again, I don't want to, this is not a judgment call. This is merely a challenge that we've got to try to make this skin look smoother in a faster way. And this came up earlier, Jamila, it may have been with you, were saying you really had no good place to sample other texture from. I mean, and the same thing exists right here. If you take a look at her forehead up here, it's almost blown out. There's very little texture that's actually happening up in here, and certainly in this area that's really blurred. You can't use that really blurred. This is actually, her forehead is receding at this part. It's further back in space. It's not in focus. So if you actually use this to be the texture for this area that's under this eye right here, it does not, it's just simply not believable. You end up with it looking exactly like the overly retouched shit that you see in every, you can't go into Walgreens or Sephora or Ulta or any of those places, whatever, and not see the worst retouching in the world. So at any rate, again, our job is to avoid that. So, but I am going to go ahead and split this looking at this sort of scale of it right now. I've got my low layer selected, so I'm going to blur it until I don't see any of that texture anymore. So up to the filter menu, down to blur, down to Gaussian Blur, and I'm going to drag mine back to I'm just going to start dragging it up. So I'm up around like a 1. So at the point that I get 2, I've still got visible texture here that I know I want to get rid of. So this is not enough blur yet. So I'm going to go up to 3. And I've still got texture in here that so remember, whatever I cannot see here is going to be the texture that ends up in the high layer. So I'm trying to blur this enough that I can't see any of that stuff, knowing that that's what will wind up in the high layer that I can then work on. So I'm going to go up to a 4. At a 4, I'm getting pretty close to this. Again, I've got areas here. I can still see the lines on the side of her mouth. I can still see all those, but a lot of that is tonal. That's not real detail. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and accept this. I'm going to type in just a straight 4 if you want to do the same thing that I'm doing. It's a radius of 4 pixels, and I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. Then I'm going to turn on my high layer. I'm going to select my high layer so that I can go ahead and finish the split. So up to the image menu, down to apply image. In the apply image part, we're going to select in the layer drop down, we're going to select the low layer. In the blending mode, we're going to change this from a multiply down to subtract. In the scale, we'll leave it 100% opacity, a scale of 2 and an offset of 128, and we're going to go ahead and say OK to that. And then finally, we are going to change the blending mode of this down to linear light. What was the what? Yes. I will do it again really quick. So up to the image menu, down to apply image. You want to make sure that the layer selected, the second word down, is the low layer. That's what we are subtracting from this full layer that we're on right now. We're going to subtract that low content. Change the blending mode to subtract, 100% opacity, a scale of 2 and an offset of 128. And say OK. Makes this thing look like a high pass filter is what it looks like. And then change the blending mode here from normal down to linear light. Now to do your check, you should hold down the Shift key and select both the high and low layers, and then use the flyout menu right to the right of the Layers tab to get the flyout menu and come up and say New Group from Layers, and we're going to call it Split Frequency. And then turn the eyeball on and off. And what we're doing is a check. If you see any change, you've done something wrong. If you see no change, like I don't see any change, the split was done correctly. Everybody good on this part? Okay, the next part gets tricky. So for the next part, I'm going to ask you guys to actually look at these. It's a folder of images. I'm going to ask you to look at it in Bridge. So if you can go ahead and fire up Bridge for me, it's just the easiest way to see the folder that I want you to look at. So go ahead and fire Bridge up. And what you're looking for is go back to our Session 7 folder, to the Split Frequency Retouching folder, and inside of this folder you'll see there's 2 other folders. One is called Skin Brushes and the other is called Skin Texture. Now the Skin Brushes exists here. I don't really think Skin Brushes work, and I'll show you why I don't think they work. If you come in and take a look at our girl, again I'm going to zoom into her a little bit tighter here, hide everybody else. Look up at my screen really quickly so you can see what I'm talking about here. Skin has something we call grain, and if you take a look at the skin grain of this girl, if you look at the grain underneath her eye, you can actually see that the skin grain is moving horizontally. It actually moves underneath her eye in a horizontal fashion. But if you take a look at the skin that's right next to the side of her mouth, you can see that that's almost moving in a vertical direction. Skin has direction. The grain of the skin has direction. Now you can go in with a brush and you can reorient how the brush works. So I could take one of those skin brushes if it had the right texture and I can orient it to then paint across the skin that's underneath her eyes to actually go in a horizontal fashion. But then I would have to change the orientation of the grain to actually go up and down to actually deal with the stuff that's on the side of her face. And at the end of the day, it just ends up being way too complicated. And then if the texture does, it's a nightmare to do this. So I don't know anybody who really uses skin brushes to do this stuff. I think that's more of a fad. I think people are selling and making money using skin brushes, but that's just me. Instead, what we're going to do is we're actually going to steal the texture of someone else's skin and put it on her and make it the texture of her skin. So to do that, again, in the split frequency folder inside your session number 7, there's another folder called Skin Textures. And if you can actually grab that folder and drag it on top of Bridge so that we can actually look inside of it to see what it is. So could everybody find that folder and get it into Bridge? You really need to look at these things. So if you take a look, what these are is this is a collection of images that I have built over the years. They are really extremely high-res images of pretty flawless skin. Sometimes the skin in this is too flawless, and if you actually try to use it, it won't work. So I can't promise you that this image will be the one that works, or another image will be the one that works, or a different image will be the one that works. I can't promise you that. The only solution that you have is to try these things out and see if they work. But I can promise you, if you really get into a jam and all of a sudden there is a situation where you have no skin, you have no texture that you can actually steal from, then what do? You know, then you go back to doing tonal work, which will take forever, or you give up on it and you do something else, or you do what I'm going to show you right now. So you'll notice if you go through these things that we have heads at different angles. It's not so much that I'm worried about the orientation of this girl's face. So for instance, I could bring this girl's face, I'm on texture number 3 right now. I could bring her into Photoshop and I can rotate her head so that it matches the up and down of the image that I'm trying to retouch. But what you have to notice about this girl is that she's actually got her head twisted a little bit to one side. Now the girl that we're trying to match, what I'm looking for is a face that I can actually replace onto this. So again, if we take a look at your image here, I'm going to double click on the hand. The girl that we're trying to fix is pretty much facing straight on. Now you do not need to worry about the lighting. The lighting again is all on the low layer. It does not matter. I'm trying to find something that will allow me to map new texture onto this image, but it's oriented the same way. So the girl that I was just looking at here, don't do this to me. Sorry, I hit the wrong button. If I look at this image, her face is turned slightly to her right, or our left. So you can see more of one cheek and less of the other. That is not the same orientation. If you look at the girl next to it, she's in full profile, even though I could rotate her face so that she was completely upright, not like she's looking for God, but more she's looking for the car that's going to crash into her. But that's still not going to help me. I need something that's oriented the way that the figure that I've got is. The next girl over, number 5, is a little bit, again, she's turned her face a little bit to the side. That will not work for me. The girl that I've got next is a possibility. She's pretty straight on. I get nervous about the hair that I've got covering one side of her cheek, but if I was just going to go after a mouth or a nose, I think I would be okay. However, it also strikes me that the camera is a little bit lower than this, that I'm seeing her a little bit lower, I'm seeing more of her nostrils. That's not going to work for me. The next image over is one that I actually use a lot, and so it gives me both a straight-on view, and it also gives me a profile. So what I did, but again, I've only got half the face, but that's not going to be a problem for me. So what I did is if you actually go skip an image and go to skin texture number 9, you'll see that what I did was I took those profiles, I simply duplicated the profile, flipped the duplicate, and put it back together. Now, I've got to admit that that gives this girl an extraordinarily broad face, but that's, again, not going to be my problem. The texture in this part is correct, and we should be able to map it correctly as well. So this is the one that I'm going to go for. But you will notice that, again, you've got varying degrees of skin that have different textures that are also angled in different ways, and all of these are high enough res files for you to be able to work on any size res file that you've actually got. But this is going to be the texture part that you ultimately get. This image number 16 would be another candidate that I could use. And image number 21, nope, she's turned too far to the side. All of these are too far to the side, too far to the side, too far to the side. Possibly image number 29 is a little bit more square on. Again, I would do that same trick before to get rid of the hair. I would simply open this up, duplicate the image, flip it so that her right side was on both of it, and we should be good to go. Does that make sense how I actually built image number 9? Do we need to look at that, how that happened? Are we good? Let's look at it really quick. Open up 7 really fast. So in 7, all I did was, again, I'm going to duplicate this layer. I'm actually going to do it twice. It'll just make it easier. I'm going to turn off the bottom because I don't want to see it. I'm going to turn off the eyeball of the top because I don't want to see that either. I'm going to select the one that's in the middle, hit the V key to get the move tool, and I'm going to simply drag this girl to the side until she's somewhere in the middle. I'm going to turn on now the top layer and make it active, and I'm going to flip it so that I have the other side of her face. So up to the edit menu, down to transform, down to flip horizontal. She's now going in the other direction. Still with the V key, I'm going to actually drag it out, and then I'm just going to stick these two together, and that's how I built the face. So again, it's an odd looking face, but that's not what I'm concerned about. I'm just concerned, I'm going for the texture part right here. That's going to be the mission that I'm going to go for here. I can flatten this image at this stage of the game. It doesn't matter what else I do, so I'm just going to flatten this guy. And this is actually the image that I'm now going to work with. So my first move is to take this new image and put it on top of the one that I'm trying to fix. So I'm simply going to grab the layer, drag it over on top of the image that I need to fix, hold down the Shift key to center it and let go. And you can see it comes in and I'm off to the races. So this is the beginning of the process. I'm going to close up the image that I just did that with. I don't need to save that anymore. I'm going to first do some work on this image, and the thing that I actually run into, the biggest problem that I run into with these images is the transition where you go from skin to nostrils, from skin to eyes, and from skin to mouth. So I typically will try to get rid of these things first. So to get rid of the mouth, I'm going to hit the L key to get the lasso tool, and I'm simply going to circle the mouth. And then I'm going to go up to the Edit menu, down to Content Aware Fill. Again, we looked at this all before. I'm going to push this to the side. Now you can see that it's done an okay job of that. It's actually, though, using part of her eyes. That's what this green is all about. This green is, where's Photoshop sampling? Where's Photoshop looking to actually figure out the replacement for her mouth? And you can see that it's got too much that it's actually of her eyes. So the brush will allow you to get rid of that green. So again, if we can paint away the green areas, then that is no longer being used to calculate the new mouth. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side because I know that that's not going to help there at all. Also, her eyebrows are not helping at all. So then I'm going to actually take a look at the patch that's actually happening in here. we went through this last week. I'm going to try the different fill settings. So instead of my color adaptation being at the default, I'm going to see what none looks like. And that shows me something way too strong on the side. So I'm going to go back to default. It's better. I'm going to then go to high. I almost maybe like that better. And then up to very high. Zoom into this and see. Again, I'm looking for texture in this area. Go back to default. Default just seems smoother around all of this to me, so I'm actually thinking I'm going to stick with default on that, and I'm merely going to say OK to this. Command D to deselect. So I would probably do the same thing on her nose. Yeah, I'm actually going to do the same thing just on the shadow part of her nose. And again, content aware fill this. And I feel pretty good about that part. If I need more of her nose, I might have to do this a second or a third time, but this is just going to give me a little bit of wiggle room in here, so I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. Then the trick to this is to map this girl's face to the other girl as well. So I'm going to double click on the hand. I'm going to drop the opacity of the layer that I'm actually working on, and I'm going to transform it, Command T. Actually, I've still got an active selection going around her nostrils, and that's why my Command T, my transform, is that small little box. So I'm going to hit the circle with a line through it to kill that. Command D to deselect, and then Command T again to actually do a transform. So I'm going to push this up next to her face. I'm going to click on the link between width and height, and I'm actually going to then make this smaller. And typically what I'll try to do is I'll go in and I know that I need to get close to her eyes. So I'm going to try to, again, match this overlay to her eyes. Eyes to eyes. So I'm just making it smaller and still dragging it in. I haven't done the command. I'm still in the Command T part. And what I'm also looking for is to make sure that her cheek is actually long enough to hit the bottom of her chin. Now you can distort this new face as much as you want. So I'm actually going to click on it to drag it down a little bit. I need to make sure that it covers all of her chin, all of everything else. I'm going to unclick the link between width and height, and I'm going to make it a little bit narrower and drag it up a little bit more to make sure that her eyes are actually above the other girl's eyes. Because if I'm going to use this as new skin underneath the eyes, I don't want eyelashes from my new face to actually impact my old face. So I'm going to make it a little bit taller and make sure that this is still covering all of her. There's a slight twist in the girl's head. So again, I'm going to bring my cursor outside of the transform box so that I can reorient this so that the eyes are pretty close to one another. Pull this down just a little bit to make sure that I've got enough there. And so now what I'm sort of feeling is I'll get the nose to line just a little bit more. The nose seems like it's pretty good there. So I'm pretty close here. I'm at least close enough to sort of give you some idea of how this is ultimately going to work. I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. So hit the check mark. I'm going to drag the opacity all the way back up. And then I'm going to split this image. So again, it's the same process that we went through before to do the original split. Command J twice to make 2 copies of that. I'm going to double click on the middle layer here and I'm going to call it low 2. We need to make a distinction between low 1 or the original low and low 2. So I'm going to call this low 2. And I'm going to call the other one high 2. And say OK to that. I'm going to turn off the eyeball for high 2, select low 2, and then I'm going to simply zoom in here and I'm actually going to do the split again. So I'm on low 2, up to the filter menu, down to blur. In this case, it's a blur of 4. It's the same one that I had before. I don't know if that really matters as much. If it does the trick, I would argue that it makes sense to go with it. So I'm going to go with this 4 blur for the low layer of our second face. I'll simply say OK. I'm going to click on the high layer, make it active, turn its eyeball on, and again come up to the image menu, down to apply image. In the drop-down menu for layers now, you need to find low 2, because we're going to subtract low 2 from high 2. And again, the rest of it should be fine, again, because the blending modes are sticky. So it should still say subtract. 100% opacity, a scale of 2, and an offset of 128. And I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. And then I'm going to change the blending mode of this to linear light. And again, hold down the Shift key and click on low 2 and high 2 to put them into the same group together. And call it split 2. And say OK to that. And then here's the trick. What I want to do is I want to sample texture from split 2 and paint it into this texture of skin 1. So this gets a little bit tricky, so I'm going to show you how I figured this out, the best way I can figure out to do it. You need to make sure that your rulers are showing. So if your rulers are not showing around your image, come up to the View menu and come down to Rulers so that they are showing. There'll be a check mark right next to it. Then I'm going to open up both of these groups so that I can actually get to them. So I'm opening up split 2. I'm going to turn off layer 1, that is the new face. I'm going to open up my split frequency, my original one, and we're going to be pretty much off to the races right now. I'm also going to turn off the eyeball for low 2. We don't need any of that anymore, but I do need to change the... Nope, that actually is. I'm going to leave that on then. That's odd. I don't know why that actually happened. Hang on one second. Just make sure that nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. Okay. Turn this guy off. Oh, that's actually what's happening. Okay. Doesn't matter. Okay. We now need to actually orient a place where we are on the new high layer, the new texture that we've just brought in with the old one. And to do that, you need to make a target point on this girl's face, and you use it using guidelines. So I'm going to come up to my top menu, my top ruler. I'm going to grab and simply pull a guideline down, and I'm looking for something that's sort of on the side of her nose, underneath her eye. I'm going to do it on the left-hand side of my image. It's just easy for me because it's right there. I'm going to grab a guideline from the ruler on the left and drag it over. And so I've actually got a target point right now that I can use to orient my clone stamp tool. And that's the tool you want to use for this. This is going to be, it's not a healing tool a situation here. This is a direct replacement. So then I am going to hit the clone stamp tool, the S key. In terms of the setting of the clone stamp tool, I'm going to leave my hardness around to 50%. That's a standard for the clone stamp tool. A normal blending mode, 100% opacity, 100% flow, but most importantly, you do want to have aligned checked, and you also want current layer only checked. You don't want anything else. This is strictly going to be a layer to layer thing. Now I've got high 2 is actually selected, so what I'm really going to be doing is picking the texture from this. I'm going to zoom into this target that I made using the guidelines. You'll see that with the clone stamp tool selected, there is actually a crosshair right in the middle of the tool. And what you want to do is, again, I've got this high layer selected. High 2 is actually selected. I'm going to come over at the crosshair. I'm going to hold down the Option key and click. That has now set my source point on this, on the second girl's skin that I actually brought in here. You don't need to see this anymore. You can actually now turn off split 2. You don't need to see this part anymore. You can turn off the image of this, and what you need to do is now select the high original high, the high that's actually of the skin that we're trying to fix, because this is now going to be my destination. I am going to go back to my tablet again to do this. And then what you want to do is you want to come in and you want to put your clone stamp tool again right over the crosshairs of that. Hold down the Option key and click. That is now giving you the destination. So our source now of the clone stamp tool is the girl that we brought in, the second girl with the better skin. The destination now is this layer, but it's only texture. I'm not doing any of the tonal work. Any of the color or the tone, any of the low layers, I'm not touching those, although you could do those as well. And then I'm simply going to start to paint in new texture on this girl. Now at this stage of the game, this does not look like it's doing anything, because it isn't. Try this one more time. Current layer. Destination. There we go. And now I can simply paint, and what I'm actually painting is new skin texture from the other image that's covering this girl's skin texture right now. You need to be careful about how much you really do of this part, but our clone stamp tool now is oriented too. So we should be able to run up along the nose line. Those parts should work still. And across the bridge of her nose. It could get a little hairy right around her. Wow, this is such a poor choice of words. Hairy around her nostrils. But again, the noses should be pretty close. They look like they were pretty close. And continue to work my way down here. Not sure how far I'm going to go out on her cheek, but we'll see what this all looks like. Again, I'm not going to spend forever doing this. There's a weirdness that just happened right here in this little area right here above her cheek. It may be that I need to move that face around, so I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that part. Well, actually I need that part, so I'm not going to Command Z it. We'll see what it looks like in the end. And so this is where I'm at on this part of the skin. I'm going to hit Command H to hide that part. I'm going to turn, again, my new split frequency work on and off, and you'll sort of see the change that I've actually made here. This is a good jumping off point. Do I still need to actually do the tonal work on this? Yes, I do, but I've got a much better sense of skin texture to work with here than I had before, and it's actually extremely fast. Does this make sense, everybody, what just happened? This doesn't only work for skin. This works for for a lemon rind. This works for grass. This works for brick. This works for shingles. This works for oceans. This works for beer foam. This works for, you can do this for anything. And I can promise you no one knows this. So show this to a recruiter and triple the amount of money you're asking for. Are there any questions about this part? All right, you can close this guy up. A lot of times when I find, okay, so this would have been a great one for the swimsuit in terms of restoring texture to that. So anyway, any place where you run into that problem, this is actually a good shot for it. All righty. Next image we're going to open up is in our session 12 folder, there is another folder inside of there called Moire Photos. If you actually click on that, I'm going to click on the one that's called Moire JPEG. You don't need to open it up. You can just look up at my screen, but this is the worst possible case of Moire that I've ever faced. So if you don't know what Moire is, if you've ever seen this pattern, if you don't know what Moire is, you see it on television all the time. If you ever watch the news and the newscaster newscaster has a tie on, and all of a sudden the tie color starts shifting in it, or it looks like it's actually got a pattern on it that's almost alive, the reason that's happening is Moire. If you actually go online quickly and do a new search for Moire, M-O-I-R-E, it's a French word, you can actually see images of Moire and what's really happening. This is another perfect example of it right here. What happens is this, and you should also know this because, again, especially as anybody who's shooting fashion, you definitely need to be aware of this part. Moire happens when you have two sets of screens that are very close in size to each other, and they cross. So the screens that you end up happening in digital this is the one major downfall for digital when it comes to actually shooting fashion, is that one screen that you have. So again, when I'm talking about screens crossing, that's basically what's happening right here. Let me show you this picture right here. This is another example of it right here. This is two screens, sets of parallel lines that if they were perfectly in line with one another, then it would just look like Venetian blinds. But when they get crossed at an angle, a pattern develops in between where they ultimately end up interacting, and that's Moire. The two screen patterns that you have in digital, the first is actually the sensor. There are sensor lines that are done in simply rows. They're rows of pixels on your sensor. That's one screen. And the other screen is the fabric that you're actually shooting. So how do you avoid this? Because I gotta be honest with you, getting rid of Moire is a nightmare, an absolute nightmare. However, I'm going to show you a couple of tricks to get through one kind of Moire, not the other, but one kind anyway. I'll show you a trick how to eliminate that. But the better move in this is to never shoot Moire to begin with. So how do you avoid shooting Moire? This is not something you're going to find anywhere, so it would be worth your while to take a note down about this. Because if you confront it and all of a sudden you shoot it and you've got a whole group of images where you've got to retouch it out of, you think tonal retouching took you long. Believe me, this takes you much longer. So the way to avoid it is that you need to make the screens different in scale to one another. The reason this happens is when the screens or the sets of lines are relatively close to each other in size. So the way you can actually shift the size is, well, there's two methods of doing this. In most cases, you have to do both. But the first thing to do is stop down. If you can go, so let's say you're shooting at f5.6, f8, f11, something, stop down as much as you can. Bump your ISO up and get to that 16 or 22. It will seriously help with your Moire. Unfortunately, because you introduce diffraction once you've stopped down that much, and so it's a bit of a softening. But again, a slightly softer image that you then turn around and sharpen that doesn't have Moire in it is a better solution than to try to retouch Moire out. So your first move is to stop down. Your second move is to actually change the scale. So if you are getting Moire, say for instance you're getting it at this focus right here, so this is basically crotch to head, change your focus, move way, way, way back. Get this girl full length and shoot another picture. If you're lucky, the difference in scale, because you've made the girl now considerably smaller, it will not match as much. You may still have some Moire, but it won't be as bad. And then once you shoot her full figure, then you simply enlarge the image to get back to this focus. So you don't shoot at this focus, you shoot much further back to change that scale to try to break that relationship between the two sets of lines. Does that make sense, everybody? The questions about this part? Okay, this is pattern Moire. This is a nightmare because the only way to actually fix this is literally to go in with the clone stamp tool and try to clone the fabric so that you don't see that pattern on it. And so this is what we're really talking about. You don't need to open this image. I'm just going to open it and I'll show you on mine. So all these dark patterns, you've got to go in and actually sample the light pattern and clone stamp over the dark pattern. And you have to do it that you actually get the material to line up. A retouch like this could take a week easily. One image. That's how bad this is. So that's one kind of moire. And that's the only way to fix it. And you'll hate your life if you have to do that. As a fashion shooter, the things that you look out for, the way you suspect moire right off the bat, any tweed will moire, any synthetic fabric will moire. So rayon, nylon, all of those things. The reason those moire more than a natural fabric is because the lines, the threads of that synthetic fabric are all perfectly identical. There is no variation. If you're actually doing a coat that's like a wool coat or something like that, there's so much variation in the thickness of the thread and the weave of the thread that it breaks up that perfect grid, so you don't get moire usually in those. But again, in a tweed, the fabric itself, the weave of it itself, whatever, will give you moire. So these are the things that you need to look out for. The biggest problem with this is that when you're shooting these things, this image that we're looking at right here, this was a screen capture of an actual outfit that I was shooting. When we went and developed the file, there was no moire. What you're seeing here is the preview on the screen, because the preview was reduced in size. The reduction of size caused the image that we were looking at to match the size of the sensor, and it moired. But the reality is that the real file, once it was processed out, was 4 times larger than this, and it broke that relationship, and there was no moire in this at all. So word to the wise, if you're shooting this stuff, if you see this, you actually need to do 100, again, you all should be shooting in Capture One right now. If you see this, you actually do a focus check on it. The focus check will actually take your file to 100% and process it. So then you'll know if you have it. That's not the problem. If you see it, you check to see if it's going to be in your final image. That's not a big issue. But if you don't see it, that doesn't mean it's not there for the very same reason. You are looking at a preview, not the final file. So that's why it helps to know the things to look for, the types of fabric to look for, in order to say, okay, I suspect this. I'm going to go ahead and process one of these files out to see that if I have moire or not. Make sense? All right, you can close this part up. I'm going to show you how to deal the other kind of moire, because there's 2 kinds. If you go into the other image in here, there's a file. Again, I'm back in the moire photos in our session number 12. There is a color moire removal.tiff file. If you'll actually open this guy up, and you can simply open this as a smart object. That part doesn't matter. And zoom in to her left boob, and you will see color moire. See this little target right here? That's actually color moire. This is far easier to remove than pattern moire. Does everybody have this file open? Does anybody have this file open? All right, so the way you fix it is this. Duplicate the image to begin with. So Command J. This is a smart object. We need to rasterize this because the work we're going to do on this, it will be destructive. So again, I'm just going to come up to the layer menu, down to smart objects, down to rasterize. I can now actually work on this. Then you want to blur this image until that moire goes away. So I'm going to come up to the filter menu, down to blur, down to Gaussian Blur. And we just start doing it till you can't see that color target part anymore. So I came up with a radius of 4 to begin with, and I can see it plain as day. So I'm going to jack this up to 5. I'm going to jack it up to 10. I can still see it. Don't go any higher than you need to go. At 12 or at 10, I can still see it. At 13, I can barely see it. At 17, it's still slightly there. All right, so I'm up at 19. If you want the same value that I'm going to use, that's where I'm going to go, is 19. So I'm going to click on that and change that to 19. I can't see it anymore. Then you need to change the blending mode of this layer from normal down to color. And you will see that the moire is now gone. However, we've got another problem. If you zip back out, you will also notice that this girl has now got a halo around her entire body. Again, if we turn this on and off, you will see the halo that exists around that. And that was due to the amount of blurring that we actually had to do for this. So to fix that, we only need the moire. We only need to fix it where we have it. So I'm going to hold down the Option key and click on Add Layer Mask to this. It will put on a black layer mask, and then you can hit the B key to get a brush. Make sure that it is a normal brush, that it is medium hardness is fine on this. 100% opacity, 100% flow. White is going to be my foreground color, and then you can simply paint over those areas where you see it. However, if you zip in and look at this swimsuit, again, this is one of those cases, synthetic fabric, you can see there's color moire over this entire thing. It's everywhere. So to fix that, I'm going to double click on the hand to kick back out. I'm going to grab the quick selection tool, and I'm simply going to select the suit. I'm going to check areas here where it's like come out onto her arm, hold down the Option key and actually drag across that so I don't impact her arm. There's a little spot right there. I'm not too concerned about the area right around her fingers. I don't worry about that. There's an area that's under her arm that I do want to get rid of, and actually the sky that's along the side, I also want to get rid of that. And a little skin that's on the other side, get rid of that. And some that's right on her neckline, get rid of that. And we're pretty good right here. And then again, working on your layer mask, simply fill it with white. White is my foreground color. Option delete, Command D to deselect. You've now removed all of the color moire. Take a look. Turn that layer on and off and you can actually see it return. Look at that area right on her left boob and you can see it actually come in and then go back out again. That's how you actually fix moire, color moire. Doing pattern moire, your only solution is to literally clone stamp it out. Questions? Can close this guy up. We have not done focus stacking or panoramas in this class yet, have we? I'm going to do it right now. So if we go back, I want to say it's in 9 or 10 or 12. Yeah, it's actually in 12. So if you go into our class files for session 12, you'll actually see inside that folder there's another folder called Panorama Files. You do not need to, I'm going to show it to you on my screen what's inside of this and explain to you what it is and how it was actually shot. So these are files, and you should know this. You do not want these files to show up anywhere in your life. These are files actually done by a photographer named Seth Resnick. He's probably the leading, if not, he's one of, if not the leading stock photographer in the United States. He and his wife did a workshop on working in Lightroom, and these were some working files from that workshop. So I've used those ever since, but I'm telling you right now, if you actually put this on your website and say, oh, look at how great I can actually do panorama work and all that kind of stuff, whatever, you will hear from a lawyer in a minute. So just a word to the wise. But at any rate, if you take a look at what it is, he actually lives in Miami, and he went up on his rooftop, and this could not be more down and dirty. He did not use a tripod to do this. He didn't even use the same exposure for all of these frames. He put everything on auto, and he just took his camera. He starts, it's actually happening at sunset. He's facing, this is actually facing southeast, and he takes a picture, and then he just literally turns his camera and just is doing bang, 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 bang frame as he actually makes a spin going from looking at southeast to southwest. And so this is what happens, and you can just see him moving around, his camera around, and then that's it. And you can see in the final image, look at the difference in the final image because his camera's on auto and he's actually facing the sun, which really causes him to underexpose the houses that are at the bottom. But look at this next to another group of the houses as well. Sorry. You can see the difference in the exposures on this. So actually trying to stack this together in a panorama is a nightmare to actually try to do it manually. So we are not going to try to do this manually. We're actually going to do this in Photoshop. So to do it, come to Photoshop, come up to the File menu, come down to Automate, and down to Photo Merge. So again, I'm up at the File menu, down to Automate, down to Photo Merge, and let go. It'll actually open up a Photo Merge dialog box. At the top, on the left-hand side, you'll see the layouts. Depending on how your images were actually shot, different versions of this can work a little better for you. So I need everybody to look at me really quickly right here. So imagine I'm Seth, and I'm trying to actually do the shooting, and this is Miami in front of me right here. And I start by actually shooting over here. In Seth's case, what he's actually shooting pictures of are buildings that are extremely far away, and then the ocean that's beyond that, it's extremely distant to him. And then when he actually turns and shoots here, there is not that great a shift in terms of his focal length distance, in terms of what he's doing. And in terms of the scale of it all, they're actually extremely close to one another. But now imagine me doing that in this room. I'm going to start over here and I'm going to shoot a picture of that wall. And that wall right there is 15 feet away from me. But by the time I get to that wall in the back, it's 30 feet away from me. And the distortion that we get just because of the distance away from me is serious. And that's what these other possibilities right here are about. So if you end up doing focus stacking, depending on the way you shot it, and you're not happy with how Photoshop puts your images together, you can actually try these other options. So you will see in this perspective one, this is pretty much what I was actually talking about here, was the issue that we would actually have is that that whole shift in perspective part. So if I found that this didn't work because the objects that I'm shooting are so radically different in the distance away from my camera, you can try either perspective to put it together or cylindrical to put it together. Those will allow differences for you to actually do that part of it all. Collage attempts to actually do multiple images like this. I never find it to work very well. And then finally, reposition, and this is a big one here. If you're planning on shooting these things, the rule of thumb, you're going to hear this, but you're not going to see this on the video, but you will hear it. I need everybody to look at this whiteboard back here. The advantage of being able to do this is you end up with incredible landscapes. You end up there's people who actually do this to, in effect, create giant sensors. You can actually, instead of taking you take a regular landscape photograph with your camera, single frame, right? It gives you a 60 megabyte file, and that's it, right? Imagine doing that same scene made up of 120 photographs. Then you've got a sensor that's 120 times the size. You want to talk about resolution? If you're going to do that, though, this is the trick. You need a 40% overlap of everything that you do in order for there to be enough common material in 2 frames to stitch them together. So how do you do that? Well, you take your first frame like this, and then they say 40%. I just use the 50% mark. It's easier to do. You simply overlap this. You just put the very center of your camera on the edge. So this is the frame that I shoot. This is the frame that I shoot. And then I moved the center of my camera, which is right here, that little dot right there. I moved that right to the edge where this would be. And in effect, this becomes my second frame is like this. And I've got, this is my 50% overlap. Does that make sense, everybody, what we're doing? And then you just continue to go along that way. The next one, again, would be another 50% overlap. So it ends up being like this. And then you just continue to do your whole panoramic around, right? But you don't need to only move in one axis. You can also move down in rows. So I can do the next one down. So let's say I've done all of this. This is my 3 different frames here. You can do an unlimited part. The only thing that it'll take up is memory and processing power. To do the next row down, again, I need a 50% overlap. So my next one down is this. So now I've got a 50% overlap on this part. My next one is 50% overlap in both directions. It's this. I don't even know how to draw it anymore. Does that make sense? And you continue that whole row, and then you can continue row after row after row after row. You can keep going on and on and on. Does this make sense to everybody, what I'm talking about? I have a friend in New Zealand who lives next door to a photographer who only shoots landscapes. And he has got this giant rig. It's probably the size of this whole wall part right here. And he has, so it's just a frame. It's a grid of like steel that he puts together. But they actually hold cameras, and he mounts like 60 or 70 cameras into this rig. And it's all connected to a computer that aligns that all so he can actually shoot one single frame at one time doing this. And he ends up with this just gigantic file that he then prints life size. And my friend says, you go into a room where one of these prints are, and the prints are the size of this wall, but the resolution is so intense. He said he's never experienced 3D photography any closer than what happens there. He said it's the most unreal feeling you've ever had in your life, because you stand there and it's just, everything is so real. It feels spatial to you. So at any rate, for what it's worth. For us, it's a great way to actually generate backgrounds for you to use in compositing, if that's your thing. It's just, again, it's a good way to actually, it's a tool you should know about and take advantage of. So after going through all of that, you need to find those photographs. So if you click on the Browse button, it'll open up a window. We need to navigate to that. So again, this was in our class number 12. Inside the Panorama Files, click on the top file, hold down the Shift key, and click on the bottom file. You want to click all the files that you're going to actually do this with, and go ahead and say Open. And then we've got some options down here that we need to talk about. So at the very bottom of this, you do definitely want to blend these images together. This vignette removal, this really applies specifically to wide-angle lenses. Wide-angle lenses are notorious for vignetting. It's just because of the design of the lens. So if you're doing your location work, you can actually try the vignette removal. For me, it's not really, doesn't really apply to these images, so I'm going to leave it off. The geometric distortion correction, in my experience, introduces geometric distortion, so I never check this thing. I leave it off. And then finally, content-aware fill transparent areas. You can go ahead and turn this part on, and we will look at what happens with it. I'll show you what it does with it and without it both. So that's how this thing is set up. I am going to leave this on auto. It's always where you should try first. Oh, and then the reposition one. We didn't talk about the reposition one. If you have failed to do this 40% overlap part, Photoshop will not be able to know that your images actually do overlap. This reposition allows you to go in. It basically puts all of your images on what looks like a light box, and it allows you to move them around. And if you get really close to the overlap that is correct, occasionally Photoshop will recognize that and say, oh, okay, now I get it. And it'll snap it into place with it actually aligned. But a lot of times, if you don't have enough of that overlap, then you're just out. Anyway, then say OK. Command D to deselect. Now, I gotta be honest with you guys, this is sick. This is absolutely insane that it actually does it this well. I'm gonna ask you to turn off the top layer. The top layer actually has the content aware fill part of it. This is the consequence of hand holding when you do panoramas. When he actually was panning around, his camera actually started to lift up higher than the horizon, and that's why you have transparent pixels here, which he didn't shoot, and also he's introduced them down here. In the old school days of all of this, what we would do is to fix this, we would zoom into the corner. So I'm going to zoom into this top right corner first, so please do this with me. This doesn't help if you're just watching. I'm going to actually use my guidelines. I'm going to drag in a guideline, and what I'm looking for is to put a guideline right on this corner right here. I'm going to crop this image, but I want to keep as much of the image as I possibly can. I'm also going to do the same thing from the top down. I'm going to drag this down so that it's just sitting at that corner. I know that I'm going to lose part of my image, but this part is, again, I'm going to go down to the bottom, and I'm going to do the same thing at the bottom. I'm going to drag a guideline down so that I can catch just that very bottom corner right there. And then I'm going to go completely to the other side of my panorama. You can see, even though that bottom line worked well for the left side of the image, it's not enough for the right side of the image. So if you hit the V key for the move tool and hover over the guideline that's at the bottom on the other side, you can actually adjust it, and you need to bring it up to just touch the corner of the bottom of the image right there. And then finally, looking at the line that's up here, I need to do the final right edge on this. Drag another guideline out so that it actually just touches that top corner. And now the live part of the image is actually surrounded by guidelines. I'm going to hit the M key to get the Marquee Tool. I'm going to click and drag out just a little bit, hold down the space bar, and move that so that it connects. It will snap to the two guidelines in the upper left-hand corner. Let go of the space bar and simply come down, and it will snap to all of your guides. Once this is actually, selection has actually snapped to that, select your crop tool. And in the crop tool, you'll see that it changes to selection from anything else, and it'll also put the crop tools around it, and then simply hit the return key twice, and that is your panorama. If we take a look at the panorama, though, it's actually shockingly well done, because one of the things that gets to be really tricky about this is that, well, it's seamless when you actually take a look through this. You won't see anything. One of the big issues, though, are things that move during multiple exposures, like water. If we actually take a look at some of these files, I'm going to look at this one right here. It's the one next to it, maybe, or the one under it. It's this one right here. Photoshop is smart enough to realize that the water was moving between exposures, and so it dedicates a single one exposure to the entire river so that you do not get any ghosting in it being actually put together, which is remarkably smart to actually be able to do. If we also take a look, though, at the other edge of this, look at how seamless the tone of the buildings has been put in to the sunset. You don't see that transition line anymore. That seems pretty seamless and flawless to me. Wouldn't you guys agree? I'm going to go back in history before we did the crop or any of the guidelines. I'm going to get rid of those. I'm simply going to go back in history before I did any of that part. Layer visibility. I'm going to leave that part on. I'm actually going to turn this top layer on. What happened with the top layer is that Photoshop actually uses content aware to fill in those transparent spaces. Now, if you look at the top left hand of your screen, you'll see that Photoshop does an exceptional job of actually doing that part. Let me just... It does an amazing job at this top part over here. That part is actually done really well. It does the reconstruction of the building extremely well. It does the yellow building. Look at the difference here. It pulls in that part beautifully. It actually extends the river, although I would argue that this little area right down here is possibly a repeating pattern. So I would probably go in and hit that with the clone stamp tool. But as we get over here, you see the problem. The skies were actually fine. but it didn't do a good job here in the lower corner of this. The content aware part actually screws up in this part right here. So we're going to try to fix this part really quickly just to go on. To do that, I'm going to make a duplicate of this layer, Command J to actually duplicate it. I'm going to zoom into this area. And what I'm looking for is a way to carry on the edge of the shoreline right here. I'm going to try to get something to actually work along this line right here. So I'm actually going to go after this tree area right here. This is where I'm going to sample it from. So I am going to hit the S key to get the clone stamp tool. I'm going to change this hardness up to something closer to like a 75. Again, I don't want anything really blurry down in here, but this is going to be try it. If it doesn't work, then move on. Anyway, I'm going to sample this, again, area that's right on the dock right here. I'm going to put my line, my brush right on the line. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. I'm going to put it right on that line, hold down the S key, the Option key to set my point. And then I'm going to come right down here and I'm going to try to line it up right after this second little dock that's right here. And I'm simply going to click and then drag through. The boat, I don't like the repeating part of that, but I've also got to change the water right here. This is the consequence of having too sharp of a clone stamp tool. So instead, I'm probably just going to hit the L key to select this and patch tool it is going to be my guess. And simply drag this out here and let go. And it makes the blend in much better. The second boat can't really be there. It looks identical to the first boat right here. So back to the clone stamp tool, and I'm simply going to sample water here and get rid of the boat. And again, now I've got that same little problem right there. The L key, it's too sharp. Patch tool. Boom. Panorama. Questions? There is another option that's also automated in a similar fashion to this. It's in that same folder, or folder number 12. If you come down to the next file folder that I want you to look at, it's the one called Focus Stacking Files. If you click on that, inside of that, there's two different sets of files. There's Photo Stacking 1, and then there is Photo Stacking 2. Let me see what the two images are. Yeah, we'll go with Photo Stacking 1. Again, I'm going to drag this onto Bridge to show you guys what this is. So in Photo Stacking 1, basically what you can do is, unlike panoramas where you're actually trying to join images together to create a larger image, what focus stacking allows you to do is to actually take multiple images of the same thing set at different focus points. And so if you take a look at this first image right here, you can see it's a picture of a ruler. And you can see that the numbers that are up around the 30, 31 are pretty much in focus, but the back of the ruler is completely out of focus. As we start to go through these images, what you'll notice is that the focus shifts further and further to the back. And by the time you get to the last image, the back of it is actually in focus, but the front of it is no longer in focus. So we are going to put these together to actually give us infinite depth of field. That's basically what's going on here. So well, let's just do it first and then we'll talk about it really quickly. So to do this, it's a slightly different approach to this. So I am going to go back into Photoshop. I'm going to start up at the File menu again. I'm going to come down and I'm not going to do this as an automate. This is not a photo merge thing. This is actually, we're going to do a script on this. And what the script will allow us to do is to take multiple images and load them as individual layers in a single file, which is ultimately what I want to have done here. So to do that, come up to the File menu, down to Scripts, and from Scripts down to Load Files into Stack. Now, I think that they could have used better terminology, because have you ever heard of the layers palette called a stack? No, it doesn't exist. But that's what they call it in this anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and say Load Files into Stack. It's going to open up a window. It's going to, again, allow me to browse for files. So I'm going to click on the Browse button. I'm going to navigate again to that folder that says Focus Stacking folder. I'm going to open up Focus Stacking number 1. I'm going to click on the top file. I'm going to hold down the Shift key and click on the bottom one so that it picks all of them. There are XMP files in here, so you should know this part first. Once we do this, there's no way we don't get smart objects with this. We don't get raw data with this. It does not work that way at all, and we actually don't get color correction for this. So if you need to color correct your files, you actually bring all of these into, well, here, I'm going to just show you right here because this is the right way of doing it. So I'm going to cancel out of this. Instead, I'm going to go to that folder. I'm going to select all of these files. I'm going to open them, Command O. It will bring them all open into Camera Raw. You can actually see them all right here. I'm going to white balance or do whatever adjustment I need to do. I'm going to simply click on this middle of the ruler to white balance. I'm going to come up then and do a select all. And then I'm going to go right back to that same little 3 dots and say I want to sync my settings. And the only thing that I've actually done on here is in the basic panel was, the basic panel was white balancing, and it's checked. I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that, and then hit Done. When you do that, it will create sidecar files for everything that you've actually done. So now when we do the focus stacking part, it will read that XMP data when it actually is opening the file, and it will do the color balancing so that this image will be color balanced. Make sense? Then, again, back into Photoshop. File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack, Browse. Go find those panorama, not the panorama files, the focus, focus stacking files. Select the first one, hold down the Shift key, select the last one, and go ahead and say Open. You now have the ability to automatically align your source images and to create a smart object after loading these layers. I'm going to ask you to leave this part off because I want to show you how this works manually, because if you click on this and it doesn't work, then you're not going to know how to fix it. Whereas if you don't click on it and you do this manually step by step, then you have every chance of it beginning to work. So I'm going to go ahead and say I'm going to leave both of those off. I'm going to say OK to this. And all of my images are up now in a single file. So you can actually see there's 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 5 of the images that are in there. However, there's problems with this. Now, this is something that we typically do not notice when you're doing anything other than macro work. When you're doing macro work, what you need to understand is that when you actually focus a lens, what you're really doing when you're spinning that lens focus is you're actually moving either closer or further away from your image. That's what focus is all about. So in doing that, if you move closer or further away from an image, what happens? What happens to your subject? It changes size. Right? If I move closer to you, aren't you bigger? And if I move further away, aren't you smaller? So look what happens. If you hold down your Option key and click on the bottom layer, look at the ruler. The ruler actually, it doesn't only shift in focus, it changes in size. We can't do focus stacking if I've got 5 images here that are all different sizes. So that's the first move that we've actually got to fix. You will notice that the one at the very bottom is actually a smart object, which is going to fuck this up completely. So I'm going to double click on the smart object, which was the base layer. I'm going to click on the hot link, or the link that's actually underneath this to actually uncheck open in Photoshop as smart object. That is the normal behavior. You cannot use smart objects to do this. So I'm going to uncheck that because it's on automatically for every image that I open. I'm going to say OK to that. I'm going to say OK to this. Then I'm going to throw this image away and do it all over again because that will never ultimately stack. So again, up to the File menu, down to Scripts, down to Load Files into Stack, Browse, pick those 5 images, open, go ahead and say OK. Great. So again, I've got that same problem, is that if I look at my bottom image, it's completely different size as well as different focus. Your next move is to actually fix that problem. So select the bottom layer, scroll up to the top, hold down the Shift key and select the top one. You need to make sure that all of your layers are highlighted. You'll also notice that unlike a typical opening in Photoshop, the layer that's at the very bottom is not locked. That's also important. If it is locked, you need to double click on it to unlock it, because this move that we're going to do right now is destructive. I'm telling you that right now. It's actually going to change the size of all of these images. So this is a 2-step process. The first is to align the layers. So up to the Edit menu, down to Auto Align Layers. Again, I'm going to leave this on auto. The very same problems that we were talking about with perspective and all that kind of stuff exist here, but I'm going to start with auto and say OK. And now look what happens. Again, I'm going to hold down my Option key and click on the bottom. And you'll notice now that the only thing, the ruler does not change sizes at all. The focus shifts, but also look what's happened here. I'm only looking at my bottom layer. Look at all the transparency that's around here. This image has been completely retransformed to fit everybody else. And the same thing has happened for each and every layer. Does this make sense what's going on? So, Kanda, you were working with Maria doing the set that she was, the medical set, right, for fashion. This is what she was worried about, moving her camera to focus because she wanted to have the exact same frame in order to add another person. This is how she would get around that. She actually has to auto-align these layers, and they will auto-align, and then it negates her camera movements. So anyway, but for us now, this part, so everybody's aligned now, but it's not blended together. So make sure everybody is still selected, all the eyeballs are on, and it's the second step up to the Edit menu. Right underneath it, Auto Blend Layers. When Auto Blend comes up, it will give you an option to actually do Panorama. That's not what we're going to do. That's what we did last time. We're actually going to stack these images. You do want to enable tone and color correction to actually do a seamless. Again, this is akin to that exposure shift that existed in the panoramas of the city. This will actually help to blend this in so that you don't see if there's been a shift in focus or tone in any of this. And then we're going to go ahead and again still leave on content aware fill transparent areas. What that will do is create a merge stamp version of everything and then fill in any of the transparent areas that are left over using content aware. So I'm going to say OK to this. Command D to deselect, and look at the image that you've actually got. Sharp focus front to back. So This is an obvious one for doing depth of field, for shooting macro work, close-up work, jewelry, all of that kind of stuff, right? But it's not limited to that. I know I've told the story 1,000 times, so if you've heard it, act surprised. There was a student in one of my classes who was really into coffee bars. That was his thing. He wanted to shoot coffee bars. And so for his final project, he did a whole series. He went like 15, 20 coffee bars all over the city. And he had these giant prints. I mean, the prints were actually the size of one of those panels on the back wall right there. So they were 4 by 6. They were enormous. And when you went up to him and looked at him, you looked at it in the beginning, whatever, and it was like, there was something it was like that perspective thing. There was something about it that just wasn't right. And then you realized that he had focus stacked these like long quarters. So he would go into a coffee shop, he would find the longest perspective that he could get, wherever the room was, front to back, as long as it could possibly get. And he shot like 100 frames of this, focus stacking the entire thing, and then put them all together. And so all of a sudden you're looking at these pictures, and the little coffee cup that is sitting right next to the camera is tack sharp, all the way 100 feet back to the barista, back actually making shit back in the coffee bar, whatever. And everything in between, the entire thing was tack. And you never see pictures like that. And that was what it was. And they were extraordinary. So don't limit yourself to thinking of this shit like, well, I don't shoot jewelry, I don't do any macro work, so this is no place for me. It might. Make sense? Any questions about this? Okay. I can see the eyes glazing over, but. So to finish this part up, there are a couple of composites that I would like, that you guys actually did, that I would like to work on with you. So if you do not have it, still, I'm going to suggest strongly that you go on to our server. And in our server, in the class projects, under my folder, you will see that there is a composites folder here. Inside this composite folder is the entire set of actions for check layers. If you do not have those, you should. So, Conde, this would be a great one for you to actually get this back really quickly. It's also got finals of both the bodies that have been redone with the spill removed and all the weird shit in skin tone. So both of the bodies are in there. And then it's pretty much everybody's composite. All the ones that were sort of turned in, most of those are in here as well. I thought all of them were, but I think all of them are. But anyway, simply copy that folder to your desktop. Did anybody else in here not have the check layers action group? So Conde, tell me when you actually get it copied, because I'm going to show you how to load that action set so that we can actually do some work on this.
Okay, I'll take me a minute because I have to get to the server.
Are you trying to get on the server? Do you have the address? Okay. So what? Okay, hang on one second. Does everybody else have it? That sounded iffy. You do have this. So open this guy up. And it's the underscore. Just copy that to your desktop. And give me that guy back. Okay, sure. Okay, so for those of you who do not have the action set, or if you built your own and you're missing part of the color correction part, this is how we fix all of that. Inside of Photoshop, come to your actions palette. Make it active. Click on the menu just to the right of that, and we are going to come down to Load Actions. And then you need to navigate to the folder that has the composites folder, and it's this check layer set. That's what you want to click on and open. So if you click on check layer set and go ahead and say open, it will then load the check layer, the entire set of actions into your actions palette. And you should see it in here somewhere. It's just called check layers. This is what mine looks like right here. Did that work for you guys? Great. Good? Anna, you good? Okay. All right, so I've got these open in Bridge, and I want to take a look. We gotten through some of these. I think I'd gotten up to Lauren's. We did the room, right? Yeah. What I'd like to look at, we're going to bounce around here a little bit, but there's some things in here that are specific techniques that I want to really show you guys. So the first one I'm actually going to do here is Leanne's 9-1. She's actually got 2 in here, but I want you to do 9-1, the girl that's in the room. So everybody's got this image correct? Okay, so when we're looking at this image and analyzing this image, what's the first issue that you spot about this? Again, the whole sort of analysis of this. Does this girl fit the lighting in the scene? What's wrong? Yeah, the lighting would be coming from the other side, right? The lighting would be coming from the window. So instead of dealing with the one that she's actually got here, because again, this is not necessarily a clean version of this image, I'm also going to ask you guys to open up. It is the correct image, it's just we need to fix it. I'm actually going to ask you to open up the blank version, the comp body final that is the girl on, that is the yellow girl. I'm going to ask you to open that as well. That's in the comp body, that's in the same composite folder. So I'm going to hide everybody else. You'll see that the comp final one is just it's a smart object that's sitting up at the very top. Simply click and drag that smart object on top of the room image. Hold down the shift key and let go, and it will actually bring it into scale. It'll bring it in centered. I'm going to go ahead and turn off, as a matter of fact, I'm going to turn off well, I take it back. I'm not going to turn off the other image because I want to scale this. So it's about the same size. Well, I take that back. I am going to turn it off. We're just going to start from scratch here. And I'm going to, there's a curve that's on top of this where I brought this in. I'm going to turn the curve off, and I'm going to take my new figure all the way up to the very top. So this is basically the place for me to actually start to work with this image. So how do I know how to scale this image? Is there something in this image that is actually correct scaling for me that I can figure this on? Say what? The stool or the lamp, but I don't really know how tall the lamp is. I don't really know how tall the stool is. What do I know how tall is in this in all likelihood? The window. When you go to open a window, where do your hands hit? You don't open a window starting here. No, I'm talking about the handle. If you're going to grab it from the very bottom. No, but you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. No, the bar across, probably about eye height, about that roughly. I literally walked up to a window in my house. I could walk right out here to a window right here and find out it hits right about your crotch or a little bit above it. That's where the bottom part of it is. So that's how we're going to set this up for her. I'm going to start with Command T to actually scale her correctly. I'm going to move her down so that her feet are on the ground right next to the bottom of the window. Then I'm going to drag that anchor point. Again, if you don't see the anchor point, make sure that this little check mark up in the options thing is actually checked so that it will give you the anchor point. And I'm going to simply click on the anchor point and bring it down to her feet. And the reason I'm doing that is that the image transforms around the anchor point. Her feet are where they should be, so I'm just going to anchor her feet into place so that she only grows taller. I mean, that's basically what I'm looking to do here. And then I'm going to click on the link between width and height, and I'm simply going to drag this up to the point that I feel like it's hitting a little bit closer. I'm going to move her down a little bit more. So now that the bottom of the window is roughly about where her crotch is, and the top of the window is roughly about, in the center part of the window is roughly about where her eyes are. So scaling wise, she's probably pretty close into this. My scaling, if you want the same one, I increased her size to 127%. And I'm simply going to click the check mark to say OK. Now again, she's facing the wrong direction. If the light is actually coming through the window, she's got some monster light that's hitting her from the bedroom, or not the bedroom, not whatever room this is, from the room that I don't want. So I'm going to flip the girl. To do that, come up to the Edit menu, down to Transform, down to Flip Horizontal, and she goes the other way. So at least now I can try to explain some of the light is actually coming in and hitting her body. However, the thing that I'm missing in this is that she would also be backlit. And this is one of the problems that I can't tell you the number of images that I've seen from you guys. People pick all these backlighting situations, sunsets, all, sun coming down in the sky, all these backlighting situations, and I never gave you a file that was backlit. So we need to try to emulate backlighting, and that's basically what we're going to be doing here. So that's what I wanted to show you. I've actually developed a recipe for this, and you should definitely copy this recipe down because this gets to be a little bit tricky. But let me make sure now that I've just told you I've done that I've actually done that. So I think it's in session 9 was when we actually did this. Yep, and it's right here. It's actually called Backlight. You guys do not have this in your in the class files that you actually downloaded. So I'm going to put this on our server right now, and you should copy this guy to wherever you keep all the PDFs that you've had from this class. So it's called Backlight in Photoshop. You can download it right now. I'm going to open this up, and we're just going to follow the recipe through all of this. So this is basically the step-by-step that I'm actually going to use to do this, and you guys can actually do this part with me. So back into Photoshop. I'm going to close up the version of the comp file. Well, actually, I'm not going to close it up. I'm just going to park it off the way, because if we get to another file, we'll actually have a chance. I'm going to hide everybody else in here. and then on top of the girl. So the girl is sitting here in my image. I'm actually going to make her active, and then I'm going to add a blank layer on top of this. I'm going to hit the D key to default my foreground and background colors to black and white. White is my background color, so Option Delete will actually fill that with black. So this is actually going to be ultimately my backlight in all of this. So then if we take a look again at our step-by-step, so we've done all this part, we're going to load the selection, we're going to then contract it, and then we're going to actually do a couple of other things and we'll be good to go. So the first thing that I'm actually going to do is clip this to the image that's right underneath it. So I take that back. Let's not clip it. Yes, let's not clip it yet. I'm going to develop the file first. So I'm going to load the body. So Command click to load the body. This actually gives me a selection that's in here. I'm going to zoom in on this. I'm going to contract my selection now. I'm going to bring it in. If I use just this right now and I actually did the knockout, then it would just be the girl on a white background. You wouldn't have any wrap on her body. I need wrap on her body. So to do that, come up to the Select menu, down to Modify, and then down to Contract. And I'm going to try 10 pixels. The amount you contract this depends on the resolution of your file. If you have a really high-res file, it'll be a big pixel count. If you have a low-res file, it'll be a low one. But you don't really know until you try it. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK. I'm going to try 10 pixels. And it pulls it in, and it felt like a good pull in to me. If that didn't work for you, if for some reason you felt like, oh my God, that's just way too aggressive or it's not aggressive enough, just hit Command Z to undo it and then do it again and pick a different number. But I'm going to stick with 10 on mine, and I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. So that's actually pulled this part in. And then I'm actually going to get rid of this on this layer. So I'm simply going to hit the Delete key and hit Command D to deselect. Now you can see by telling it her fingers and that kind of stuff that stuff has actually come in. It's actually wrapped around this part. At this stage of the game, I'm going to blur this image. I really need to see the blur. I need to see this sort of softer encroaching on her body. However, I don't have a sense. I mean, it just looks like she's been made really, really, really skinny on this part. I want to be able to see what this really is doing on her body. So to do that, I'm going to clip this layer to the layer that's underneath it. Hover your cursor between the two layers, hold down the Option key and click, and it will clip it down. And you can now see that she's actually outlined by this hunk of white. Now, looking at this, I don't know if that's enough. You don't really see it on the other side because it's basically white on white, but you will get the sense of what's actually happening here. We're going to go ahead and blur this and see if we get enough blur. If it doesn't work, then we're going to go back in history and actually do more of a contraction on this. But we'll see how it works. So again, I'm still on this white layer. I'm going to come up to the filter menu, and I'm going to come down to Blur, down to Gaussian Blur. And I'm looking for this sort of edge effect. I'm up to like a 20 on this. It's way too much, whatever. I'm looking more for, again, I want this sort of like glow around her body to make me feel like it's actually is backlighting. And as I'm getting up in that sort of like 9, 8, 9.5, 10 pixels, something like that, and this has got to hit a little bit harder. Actually, I'm not happy with this, guys, so I'm going to hit Cancel. I'm going to go back in history to load selection. So again, the contraction was not enough. It needs to be strong. It needs to be more onto her body than this. So I'm back into history where it just said load selection, up to the Select menu, down to Modify, down to Contract. And let's try 15 pixels instead of 10. And I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. Again, I'm still working on that white layer. I'm just going to hit the Delete key to get rid of that part. Command D to deselect. I'm then going to clip that to the one in the bottom. And I've got a little bit more of a border to actually work with now. And I'm going to blur that. So up to the filter menu, down to Blur, down to Gaussian Blur. And it started with a 19 in here like this. And actually the 19 on this is not too bad. Let me crank it down to like a 12. actually around it, for me anyway, somewhere in that, yeah, 18, 19, 20, whatever. That begins to look like a reasonably good backlight for me on this. So I'm going to go ahead and say okay to that. Now the problem we've got is it's everywhere and it shouldn't be everywhere. So instead I'm going to put a layer mask on this, an opaque layer mask. So I'm still working on this white layer. I'm going to hold down the Option key and click on Add Layer Mask. We've been doing this all day today. It gets rid of all of it. I'm going to hit the B key to get a brush. I'm going to make sure that my tablet is still working. I'm going to come up to the brush hardness. I'm actually going to make it a completely soft brush. Normal blending mode, 100% opacity. I'm going to drop the flow way down to sort of like, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8, somewhere in there. That part actually work out well for me. Make it a little bit larger brush. I'm going to zoom into her hair. And I'm simply going to, again, using white, painting on my black mask, I'm simply going to start scrubbing in a highlight. Now that seems way too slow for me, so I'm going to bring that flow up to like 20-30% and do the same thing again. And you can see I can actually start to bring in where there would be that edge light. So the edge light would actually be on the top of her arm. It would be on the inside of her arm. It would be on the outside of her arm. And again, we're not really picking up much of this because it's all white on white. But as we start to get down, it'll actually make a little bit more sense. It would come down on her body as well. On the whole dress on this side, all of this would actually be. I just hit a small part on the bottom of the dress. It would never be there, so I'm going to hit the X key to actually get the black tool to actually get rid of this. You would have no backlighting under her skirt there, but you would pick it up again where you're actually seeing her legs. But there's a transition. You can see that there's a shadow underneath on her legs from her skirt. You wouldn't have backlighting in there, but it would start to pick up as you start to come down. However, it would not necessarily go all the way down to the floor. So I'm simply going to leave a little part of that right there. I'm going to make my tool even a little bit smaller. I don't want the inside of her right leg, but I do want the outside of her left leg. That seems way too strong to me. Command Z to undo that. I'm going to drop my flow back down. Now that I've got something that I'm on a darker background, I need much more control of this. And then I'm simply going to bring in a little bit of that part right there. She probably would have a little bit on her other thigh, other leg as well, but not at the top. So I'm going to get rid of that part. And then on the other side of her skirt, we can actually crank our flow back up a little bit, around a 30-ish, a little bit bigger brush. We would actually have it on the top edge of this, but probably not at the end. It would be on her side. It would be under her arm here. It probably would be on the top as well. It would certainly be on this side, but probably not on the other side. So again, it would be up on her fingers. Possibly on the other side of her head as well. It depends on where she's placed on the window, but it wouldn't be as strong as it is on this other side over here. And that's going to probably do it for me. So this is ultimately where I've landed on this. Again, I think on the legs it's a little bit too strong. So again, B key still working on my layer mask here. I'm going to drop the flow down. Hit the X key to make black my foreground color a little bit larger and just fade this back a little bit. And I'm probably going to kill it on this other side altogether. And this is now my backlight. Then as long as we're here and we've got 4 minutes to do it, I'm going to run my check layers really quickly. So again, in the actions for the check layer group, simply play the action. It'll make it a very weird color. I'm going to turn off the hue saturation in that group, and I'm going to start with my luminosity check by simply turning that on. You can tell that the girl is too bright in all of this, so I'm going to grab my highlight layer right here, I'm going to add a curve on, fuck, I'm not going to add a curve on top of this. The problem that I've got right now is I've got my backlight is on here, but if I add a layer and I clip it to this, it's going to clip to the back layer, to the backlight mask here. So the way to avoid this is hold down the, you've got the back layer selected, hold down the Shift key, select the smart object itself, and we're going to make this another smart object. We're going to nest this inside itself. So up to the layer menu, down to smart objects, and convert to smart object. And now we've actually got a smart object that still has the backlighting in it, although, yep, it's still in there. And now I can do my luminosity check and I don't need to worry about it. So clicking on the luminosity check, the image is too light, so I'm going to click on the image itself. We're going to add a curve to this. We're going to change the blending mode of the curve down to luminosity. We are going to clip this curve to the figure, to the body, so that it only affects that part of it. And I'm simply going to click the middle part and drag it down. I'm going to leave the highlights where they are. And it doesn't need to come down a heck of a lot. Maybe I am going to pull it down from the top. Down a little bit from the top and then pull down a little bit. That feels a little bit better. Turn off a luminosity check. Turn this guy on and off. It feels like it's fit into that space a little bit better. I'm going to turn on my saturation check now. You can see it's way too saturated. So I'm going to add a curve above my luminosity, the curve that made it darker, a hue saturation curve. Again, I'm going to change its blending mode all the way down to saturation. I'm also going to clip it so it only impacts the girl, and then really pull this saturation off because she's just standing out like this incredibly sore thumb. I've got mine down around a -47. We'll see what that looks like. I'm going to turn off my saturation check layer. That may be down just a little too much. I'll crank this back to around a 40, 39, something like that. Feels a little bit better. And then finally, I'm going to do my color check layers. I'm turning them both on. You can see that she's she's matching the room pretty well. Her skin color is matching the room pretty well. We can see if we can shift the skirt, the dress just a little bit. So I'm going to come down to my final luminosity. The hue saturation layer that I actually used. I'm going to click on add one last color correction, and I'm going to do color balance. I'm going to change its blending mode to color. I'm also going to clip it down so that it only impacts the girl. And then it looks like there's a yellow problem in here for me, so I'm going to grab this yellow slider and see what happens if I push a little more blue into it. She seems to go awfully red when I do that, so I'm not thinking that that's actually the right move. So I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to set that back to 0. And then I'm going to try to pull the green out of it then. So I'll push in a little bit more magenta. And it feels like she matches slightly better that way until I just actually came off. Not a good time, or not a good tool for your tablet. That seems a little bit better to me. I'm going to turn off my color check layers, and we'll see what that color correction actually did. It's this guy right here. And it puts a lot of red into this. I feel like that red is too strong, so I'm just going to cut it in half. It was a -12. I'm going to take it down to a -6. And that's feeling a little bit better to me. And then finally, the last thing that we'll do, because we're past our time, is I'm just going to do one last check on one last correction on this. Again, I would put in shadows and all that kind of stuff. I'm simply going to add one more curve. I'm going to clip it. And I'm actually going to, I take that back. Let's try another trick. I'm going to add just a blank layer. I am going to clip that. I'm going to hit the B key to get a brush, make it a completely soft brush. 100% flow, normal, 100% opacity, 100% flow. Make it much larger. I want the center of the brush to actually hit her feet, and I want the edge of the brush to actually hit up even higher, sort of up closer to her waist. So continue to make it a larger brush. And again, I'm going to put the very center right on her feet. I'm going to click once. It actually puts in a lot of darkness in this. I'm going to change the blending mode of that to luminosity, and then back the opacity of it off. I've got to get her legs darker. And, you know, I mean, that's where we're at right now. But if I do a quick history snapshot of this and say OK, and then go up to the top and take a look at the difference. This is where we were. This is where we're at now. Are there questions about any of this? Okay, I will see you guys next week. Sure. Are you coming to me or I'm coming to you? I'll come there. Let me stop the recording really quick.